Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Carol Rumpler from the admission team, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our community speaker series focusing on math at Carroll. It's our Carroll School Math Chat. I'd like to go over a couple of details quickly. We will be recording tonight's session. Also, if you have questions at any point, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen, and we will be answering questions at the end of the program. And if for some reason we can't get to your question, we will definitely be following up with an email to you. Our speakers tonight are Peter Morris and Jen McAleer. They're the heads of the math departments at both the lower and middle schools. And it's my pleasure to turn things over to them.
All righty, welcome. Thank you, Carol. So again, my name is Peter Morris, and I'm the head of math in the lower school. And I'm joined by Jen McAleer, head of math in the middle school. And tonight we are going to just give you a little chat about math at Carroll School. And just to get started, I think it's important to say, we're in the hour or so we've got together. It wouldn't be possible for us to go through, grades 1 through 9 of kind of a math trajectory for every student. Instead, what we're hoping is that you'll come out of this evening with a better idea of Carroll's philosophy behind teaching and learning math. Okay, so any good math chat should begin with a story. And our story is going to begin with a baby moon. So my wife and I used to live in Munich, Germany, back about 11 to 15 years ago, and our first son was born there. And prior to him being born, we took a baby moon. And the wonderful thing about being in Europe is, especially in Munich, is you can drive within about 6 hours and be in 7 different countries. So we decided to take a little trip before our son was born, just to celebrate our freedom before it all came to an abrupt end. And we decided to go to Lake Como in northern Italy. We've heard beautiful things about it, and it also happened to be the place where, if you are a Star Wars fan, that Princess Amidala and Anakin Skywalker kind of had their romance blossom. A lot of those scenes were filmed in Bellagio, and so that was where we were headed. Now, we fancy ourselves travelers, and we took a lot of road trips when we lived in Germany. And we had this handy dandy road atlas of Europe that we kept in our car, and we used for all of our trips. So these were the days before we had smartphones. So when we were in the car, the only way that we had to navigate around was to pull out our trusty road atlas and plan our way there. And up until this point, that had been the way we had navigated all of our trips. We open up our road atlas, we plan our route, and one of us is the navigator in the passenger seat, and the other of us is the driver. But one day before our trip, we had friends, and they had this fancy device called the Garmin. Now, I think Garmins are still around, and I'm sure they do all sorts of fancy things now. But back in the day, it was basically just a GPS. And they said, hey, we've got this Garmin. Why don't you take that on your trip? And we were a little skeptical, but we said, okay, yeah, let's try it out. It's fancy new technology. So we took it along with us. And back in the day, the Garmins, there wasn't a whole lot of route planning. You kind of just put in your destination, hit go, and it guided you there. So our route should have taken us about just under 6 hours. So 5 hours, 52 minutes from Munich, Germany to Bellagio on Lake Como. And so it was a lovely trip driving through the Alps to get there. We got to a point in the trip where we thought, we're almost there. But then our Garmin led us to the side of the lake. and then just kind of stopped, pointing us ahead. And there was no dock. There was no, visible ferry service. It was just us kind of staring into the lake at the end of this road. And so we didn't know what to do. And so, when you've got your GPS on and all of a sudden things go haywire, well, we did what everybody typically does is we said, okay, well, we're just going to keep driving. So we'll get back on the road, keep heading in a certain direction and see if the GPS, if the Garmin will eventually reroute us to a different route. And it did eventually reroute us. So we went from going from about 20 minutes away to our new route, which was another hour plus to get around the lake, because Lake Como is shaped like a wishbone. So rather than being able to drive or take the ferry directly across the lake, we had to go all the way around the wishbone. And so that was the last time we used the Garmin. The frustrating part is it guided us to the edge of the lake to try and go across the lake, all to save about 2 minutes in the end. If we had kind of stayed on the main highway and just gone around the lake on the highway, as opposed to taking all those little lake roads, the difference between doing that and trying to somehow get across the lake would have only cost us 2 minutes. So we learned our lesson. We since are back to planning our route and having a good idea of where we're going before we hop in the car. There just so happens there's a study from 2006. And in the study, researchers compared two ways of navigating. So they had one set of participants use traditional step-by-step GPS-style navigation to travel between 2 points in a zoo. And they had a second group construct their route using a map, the same way my wife and I used to do before we hopped in the car for a road trip. So they had the second group construct a map between points A and point B, and then travel that route from memory after kind of constructing the route that they were going to take on the map. And the results of that study were really kind of interesting. So the researchers assessed the route knowledge of the survey participants and found that the participants who had constructed the map and then navigated their way from memory had a much better route knowledge compared to the group that used GPS to find their way initially. So unsurprisingly, as we found out personally, the GPS does a great job of navigating you efficiently from one point to another most of the time, but it does a really poor job when you get stuck of helping you to understand the terrain and be able to adapt to changes. So typically what happens is when you get stuck, you do what my wife and I did, you get back on the road and hope that it eventually recalibrates and sends you on your way correctly. So, it gets you thinking, which one of these routes is really the most efficient? And what might the GPS consider most efficient? And the most efficient path from point A to point B might not always be the most desirable one. It might lead you across a lake. So we want, this idea of efficiency is often fluid, and knowing the terrain provides you with flexibility for when you have to adapt. Okay, so getting from point A to point B. Little example in math. So 85 times 12, there are different ways that you could do that that would be more or less efficient. And the way we teach math is very much like the way you might navigate around the screen, navigate around from point A to point B. So just like with navigation, with math, there are different routes from point A to point B, and some of those routes might be more or less efficient. And sometimes that idea of efficiency needs to be flexible. So Dan Meyer has talked about this study. Dan Meyer is a math teacher and a math consultant. And he's talked about this study, and he said the researchers explain their results from the perspective of active learning, arguing that travelers need to do something effortful and difficult while they learn in order to remember both the route and the survey knowledge. So those participants who were just navigating from point A to point B in the zoo by following the GPS weren't constructing a map in their brains. And so when they didn't have the GPS, they were really rather lost. Whereas the students who had to actively construct their path from point A to point B, even when that map was taken away, they had a much better idea of the landscape and they were able to adapt to changes and find different routes. And Shannon, math consultant, calls this the GPS effect. So she asks for teachers to avoid GPSing students. So GPSing students means the tendency to tell students step by step how to arrive to the answer of a math problem. So she says, in a car, you usually arrive at your destination having learned little about your journey and with no overview of your route. And it's the same in math. So if we GPS our students and just kind of tell them step by step how to get from point A to point B, they usually arrive at their destination having learned little about what it takes to get from point A to point B in more flexible and efficient ways. And when they're asked to do a problem, they usually only have one strategy for doing so. So again, we want to avoid that GPSing of students. The effect of GPSing on students. So when we get students step-by-step instructions that will enable them to arrive at an answer to a math problem, often painlessly, passively, and without struggle, we're trading away their opportunity to learn mathematics, right? So in learning anything, and especially in learning math, productive struggle is a really important part of learning and making connections. And so if we kind of give students step by step for how to get to point A to point B, and they're not active participants in their learning and actively engaging in productive struggle, the impacts of that learning are going to be far less long lasting. What we prefer to do, rather than GPSing students and holding their hand and guiding them lockstep in one way of doing things, is we want to really help them to construct a map. So in math, constructing a map of the landscape means being able to identify landmarks. What are important numbers? 10, 100, 1,000. When you get to fractions, the number 1 is a really important landmark. So we want them to be comfortable knowing where those landmarks are, understanding how to navigate those landmarks, so that they can solve math problems flexibly and efficiently. In short, we are trying to engage them in experiences that help them make connections. And so we want them to make connections because those connections will be longer lasting, and the strategies that we're teaching them will stick with them far more powerfully and for a longer period of time than if we simply give them a set of steps and procedures that they don't really understand. So I'm going to hand it off to Jen. She's going to run you through the next part of our presentation.
Perfect. Again, my name is Jen McAleer. I am the head of the middle school mathematics program at Carroll. I'm going to throw you back into a little elementary and middle school math here. I want you to visualize how you might approach this problem. And I want you to think, and don't get a little nervous here, how many of you actually remember how to do this procedure? Or how many of you might have to step back and remind yourself of how to do this? Are you going to remember what keep, change, flip actually means? Are you going to think about this procedurally, keep, change, flip, or are you going to think about it more conceptually? And while you're thinking about that, we're going to skip along to a video. And on the next slide, you'll see someone that you might recognize, Patricia Heaton. And we're going to watch a video. It's from Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Hopefully you all remember this show. And I want you to keep that procedure in your mind and maybe some emotions that you felt as you saw that.
Here it is. Patricia, if a euro is worth $1.50. Patricia, please stay with me. 5 euros is worth what?
I am so bad at math.
No, but wait a minute, you gotta
and
shout.
when I get nervous.
No. But Patricia, Ohio State.
That's what I'm telling you. Exactly my point.
Stay with us.
Okay.
Okay, so 5 euros will be worth how much at $1.50 a piece, okay?
I can't do the math.
Would it be 30 quarters?
No. Wow.
Would it be 50 dimes? Would it be 70 nickels or would it be 90 pennies? And Patricia, just think
I
about
put everything on credit cards, Regis. I have no idea what this is.
But 30 quarters would give you how much?
I don't know. I have no idea. I literally, my kids, once they got past 2nd grade, I could not help them at all with their math, at all.
Okay, then we got a problem.
I have got to.
Let's cut right to the chase. What lifeline would you like?
Poor Patricia Heaton. So when we think about our students and how they approach math, often they face math anxiety. And that's what Patricia Heaton was facing. She couldn't even approach the problem. In a 2014 study called Nervous About Numbers, it was found that 20% of the general population had math anxiety. 25% of 4-year college US students identified as having math anxiety. And 80% of community college students presented as having math anxiety or self-identifying with. Nearly 50% of all 1st and 2nd graders. 1st and 2nd graders, young. It's very early to present with some math anxiety. So if you think back to Patricia Heaton, how does that impact you? Often what we find too, and what the study found, is that math anxious parents are prone to passing that anxiety on to their kids. There's a caveat there, only if they frequently help their kids with math homework. That's not to say don't help your kids with the homework, but be aware of what you're presenting and giving off to your children as well. So math anxiety is prevalent, but what does that do to the brain? So in the beginning, heightened activity happens in the right amygdala. That's associated with fear. A stronger connection happens between that amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. That's where we regulate our negative emotions. And then there's heightened activity in the hippocampus, which is a place that we form new memories. So not only are you having these senses of fears and negative emotion, but you're forming these new memories over and over and over again about a negative experience with math. What does that impact altogether? There's reduced activity. Actually, go back, please. There's reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, which impacts working memory, attention, and numberizing, all of which we need for math. And researchers now know that people with math anxiety, when they encounter the numbers, the fear center in the brain lights up. That same fear center is what you see when you see snakes or spiders. And that anxiety is not limited to just low achieving students. It's for all students. So what we're seeing at Carroll, if you go to the next slide, that reduced working memory, reduced attention, reduced reasoning ability, and the heightened negative emotion or fear all impacts how our students and ourselves approach math. And what we found is that fear relates to before even beginning a math task, not necessarily during it. So this fear takes up the entire mental bandwidth during the math task, but also before it, and our ability to access any material in order to approach that task. So as we go back to the original problem, 2 1/3 divided by 1/6. If we approach that with less of an emphasis on, well, is your answer right or wrong, answer getting, and more of an emphasis on the process, how did you get there? Teachers are able to alleviate how students feel and how they present about math. So for example, if I asked a student, well, what does division mean? You're fitting groups of something into it. Could you conceptually think about how many 1/6 would fit into one hole? How about 2 holes? How many would make 1/3? Could our students then access it? So it's about getting them to alleviate that initial anxiety and get them to understand the process that Peter was talking about earlier. But unfortunately, we live in a world of performance culture. Most students in a study, Joe Bohlers from Stanford says, believe that their role in the math classroom is to answer questions correctly. It's all about the answer, not the process. So where does that leave us? If we present them with a problem like 79 times 9, and I as a teacher go through the answers, these are some of the answers I might see. Some of them are correct, and I'm thinking they're great, they're right on the right track. And some of them I'm very concerned about, and I want to dig a little deeper. But are the answers all where the information lies? Do I know whether my students truly understand the concept of 79 times 9? Or are they just kind of being inefficient in getting there? And could I help them get there more efficiently? So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little adventure, and we're going to watch 3 different students, solve 79 times 9. Our first student, very colorful background. Here it is.
Hello. So today we're going to be doing 79 times 9. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a box. All right? And I'm going to split the box in half. And I'm going to put a 9 here, 70 here, and a 9 here. So 9 times 9. Oh, okay. So this method is pretty simple. So you split, you can do this with 2 double digits or 3 double digits, but I'm just going to do this one. So you split the number that has a 10 or 1,000 or a single, and you split it in half. So it's like 70 and 9. Like you put the 10s in one place and the 1s in one place, and then you have the 9 just like by itself because it's a number. It's just it's ones. So 9 times 9 is 81, and 9 times 7 is 9 times 7 is 63. And then you just add on that 0 at the end because there's a 0 right there. Okay, now all you gotta do is add them. So 630 plus 81. So 0 plus 1 is 1. 3 plus 8 is 11. And 6 plus 1 is 7. So the answer is 711. So, yeah. Good job.
So here we see the student got the correct answer. She's using a rather inefficient system, but she understands it quite well, partial product. But I would like to do a little more digging. Does she actually know her facts sufficiently? How is she recalling them? And she didn't quite have the correct vocabulary about 10s and 1s. She said split it in half. Is it really, like, if you're using the area model, is it truly half of the area? And I would really push her understanding on that. But had I seen just her answer, I'd say, great, let's move on. However, when you dig a little deeper, you can see that she needs just a little bit more from us to push her to be the most efficient. If we go to the next, you're going to see yet another method. I'm actually going to skip this one, Peter. We're going to go to the third one. And I just want you to watch this. This is a very fascinating way to approach it.
So this is my explaining of the problem 79 times 9. So how I did it is I got a 100. And the way I got my 100 is I got 79 and added 21, which equals 100. And 100 times 9 equals 900. But the original answer was problem originally didn't have 100 in it, so I have to take away that 21 or 20. I'm going to start with 20, and so I'm going to go minus 20 9 times, basically, which equals 720. 720, because I still have like that 1 left, so I need to get rid of 9. So 720 minus 9 equals 711. So that's the answer.
You can tell they all love showing how great of a job they did. The fascinating thing about this method is that the student took 79 times 9 and he used, as Peter was talking about, those landmarks. So I don't know 79 times 9, but 79 is quite close to 100, or close enough for me to 100. And so I did 100 times 9. And then he didn't quite explain it in his actual numerical representation. But what he did is he then took away 20 groups of 9, or 180, and then one more group of 9. So he did 100 groups of 9 minus 21 groups of 9. Inefficient, very, very inefficient, but brilliant. And so these are the moments that we're missing out when we don't have these conversations or ask our students to show their thinking or explain themselves verbally. So a huge part of our philosophy and curriculum is to get kids talking. What is your first move? How did you get to your answer? Rather than answer getting, we get more at how inefficient some of the kids are thinking and where can we push their thinking to be more efficient. So we're going to move to one student's story. Many years ago, I met a student coming into the middle school, and I was given this Wyatt, and we have the math problem solving, numerical operations. They're pretty good. And then we have our fluency, which relative to those scores was a little bit of a deficit. And what happened was I got an email from the parent, and this is a common refrain we get from many people. If you go to the next slide, Peter. And what we had was this student was a reasonably strong math student at Carroll, but having great difficulty learning the multiplication tables. This parent was very concerned with them coming into the middle school not knowing all of their tables. I thought it would be good to nail this down over the summer, but my student's still struggling with it. I focused on having them practice through multiple modalities, including writing the fact repeatedly, saying it out loud, and having them respond to my prompts. Right now, we're working on 3s, and they know them to some degree, but they're not truly automatic, and they're struggling to get there. So the parent is generally very concerned about their math facts. And they've been told that they are a very proficient student. They've seen that content-wise, they're keeping up with their peers. So what's going on? So some of the barriers that we see is that our students have depressed working memory and processing speed often. And for our students, that really can inhibit the automatic recall of math facts. And so we need to get them to be a little more efficient with strategies. However, this is the same students track my progress. Fact fluency does not equate to math proficiency. When given the time and the space to work through a problem and the right strategies to get to the facts, our students end up performing quite well when they have those landscapes laid out for them, when they can recall those procedures. And so we really want to attend to fact fluency and math proficiency, and how do we get our kids from where they are to be the most efficient they can be.
So thanks, Jen. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this all means in terms of how we at Carroll approach fluency with our students. So when it comes to math fluency, whether we're talking about fact fluency or whether we're talking about procedural fluency, really too often fluency is just treated as the rote memorization of disparate facts and procedures. And as we talked about earlier, we really want students to make connections, and rote memorization of facts and procedures is not helpful in terms of getting students to make connections. So think about like typical drill and kill fluency practice, right? So just doing flashcards over and over and over again, because you just got to remember those facts. Students will remember some facts that way, but they're not building any connections that could really be useful for them when it comes to thinking mathematically and solving problems in everyday life and in the classroom. So when we talk about rote memorization, this does come from an actual resource. So we could think of the fact 3 times 7 equals 21 as tree times surf equals Denty sun. That would be to remember that fact. Likewise, we could think of 4 times 6 equals 24 as door times chick equals Denty floor, because of course that would be a good way to remember that math fact as well. These come from a book. I don't want to, disparage any one resource in particular, but a book that we actually found in the lower school years back in the back of a closet. And it's called Memorize in Minutes, the Times Tables, the fastest and easiest way to teach the times tables. And actually, if you look on Amazon, it gets a lot of positive, 4- and 5-star reviews. And, I won't speak to whether or not, students could remember their math facts by remembering kind of these nonsensical rhymes. Maybe that does work for some folks. But our feeling here is that mnemonic techniques like this, learned by rote, they might provide connections among ideas that make it easier to perform operations and learn facts, but they also probably won't lead to understanding. And they're not the kinds of connections that we feel best promote the acquisition of mathematical proficiency. And what we mean by mathematical proficiency is students who are able to solve problems flexibly and efficiently. So I did recycle that book. I didn't just throw it in the trash, but those are not the kinds of strategies and techniques that we prefer for our kids to learn. We'd much rather have them use relational understanding, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Back to Joe Bowler. So again, Joe Bowler is a professor at Stanford University, and we'll provide some resources at the end, but Joe Bowler talks a lot about math anxiety, and talks a lot about math fluency and kind of productive ways to teach math fluency, and also ways of teaching math fluency that might be less productive and more anxiety producing, and less built on connections. So in terms of talking about building connections, Joe Bowler says, the more we emphasize memorization to students, the less willing they become to think about numbers and their relations and to use and develop number sense. So let that sink in for just a sec. The more we emphasize memorization, the less willing students become to actually build the connections that we want them to build. Because why build the connections when I already know the answer? And you see this with both facts and procedures, right? So why think about how these numbers relate to each other when I know the answer, or I can just follow this procedure that I've learned to find an answer. But I can't think about those numbers flexibly and how they relate to each other, and how they might fit within the context of a problem. So what we really want to help students develop is what's called relational thinking. So instead of fluency of facts and procedures being solely reliant on memorization, and I say solely reliant because there is a place for memorization when it comes to learning a student's facts or performing procedures. The memorization does have a place. We just don't want it to be the primary mode of a student understanding how to do things. So instead, we want fluency to be founded in number sense. So what is number sense? Number sense is a deep understanding of numbers, facts, and procedures and how they relate to each other. So for instance, if I know 10 times 6, how can I use that to think about 9 times 6? And if I know that, if I know an addition fact, how can that help me with a related subtraction fact? How are those things related? How are the ideas of addition, subtraction related? How are the ideas of multiplication and division related? These sorts of understandings, being able to create a landscape and use benchmark numbers. So we're going to look at a few more student examples of work here and think about what we think is really important at Carroll, which is thinking about how students think about problems and work through problems and their strategies and their processes, and not simply just focusing on answer getting. So we're going to look at a few examples here. And I need to remember to mute myself. So I'll be back in a minute as we look at this first student's work. How'd you get 53? How'd you think of it?
Well, I did, I put the 20s together, which made 40, and then I put the 5s together, which made 50, and then the
Where'd you get 5s?
The 5.
I only see 1 5 there.
Because, that 5, and then I took 3 off from the 8, and then that one become 5,
cool.
and then I did 53.
Nice. So just to summarize, sometimes that video is kind of dim, so I'm not sure how much you could hear. But to summarize that student's thinking, that student was solving the problem 28 plus 25, put the 20s together to make 40, and then said, I put the 5s together. And it's like, well, where do you get 2 5s? Because, you know, I see an 8 and a 5. And that student knows that they can take that 8 and break it into 5 and 3. And one of the big things we need to ask ourselves is, how does that student know that they can take 8 and break it into 5 and 3? One of the big reasons that student probably knows that 8 can be broken into 5 and 3 is because that student's been allowed to use their fingers, right? And fingers are such an important part of learning that in some places you see discouraged, like, oh, we don't, you know, don't use your fingers to solve this problem. But fingers are such an important tool, right? There's a reason why we work in a number system that's base 10. And having 5 as a benchmark number, which this student has, is so important to learning addition facts and even multiplication facts. But that student has a benchmark. He's got a benchmark in his head of 5 and can use it in solving a problem like this. We're going to look at another example of how to solve this problem. Same problem, 28 plus 25. This student uses a slightly different strategy. So let's have a look at that.
Thirteen.
13. Cool. All right. Now what?
8 plus 5 equals...
So This student did some things that were similar to the first student and some things that were different. This student also broke the problem into tens and ones, put the 20s together to make 40, but then solved the 8 plus 5 part of this differently than the first student did. So whereas the first student broke the 8 into 5 and 3 and put the 5s together to make 10 and then added the 3 to get 13, this student was using his hands. And it might have been a little confusing to try and figure out how this student was using his hands, but what he was actually trying to do is represent all 13, so represent both 8 and 5 with his fingers. And obviously he ran into trouble because he doesn't have 13 fingers. And so he was going through the challenge of trying to count the 8 on his fingers and count the 5 on his fingers and then try and count them all together somehow. And that was a really challenging task for him, but is also something that if we're not watching for how students are solving problems, we might not pick up on. And we might ask ourselves, does it make a difference? Does it make a difference that one student is solving this problem by breaking the 8 into 5 and 3 and thinking about benchmark numbers, whereas another student might be trying to represent the 8 and the 5 and count it up by ones? What difference does that make? And is that information that a teacher should know? At Carroll, we think that's definitely information that a teacher would want to know, because giving each child what they need will mean something different for the first and second student here. So let's look at one more example, same problem, 28 plus 25, and look at another student's strategy. Oop, sorry, let me get to that next video.
Is it 32? Is that what I answered?
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I answered 32.
So I love this video. As a teacher, there's so much to unpack here. You know, if you heard this student at first, she said, 32, is that my answer? And just the working memory challenges that are evident here are just really fascinating. This student also split this problem into tens and ones. You'll notice that this student put the 2 and 2 together and kind of thought of them as digits and wrote down the 4. Still understood that that place value was 40, but represented it a little bit differently. And then when it came to the 8 plus 5, so this student had a different strategy than the first two students. whereas the first student broke the 8 into 5 and 3 and kind of put those numbers back together, and the second student tried to represent the 8 and the 5 all with fingers and count them all. This student used another common strategy, which is called counting on, where she started with 8 and then went 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 and counted on that way. And then there was another fascinating part. She counted on to get 13, but wrote down 31, which is that dyslexic brain, right? So having trouble kind of keeping track of the place values and left and right and which number goes where. But she understood that the number was still 13 because what she did is took that 1 from the 31 that she had written down, which really should have been a 10, and put it with the 40 to make 50. So just so many fascinating things going on here. None of these things would a teacher really pick up on in a traditional classroom where the teacher is only looking for answers. So if the teacher is only looking for answers, all 3 of these students got the problem right. And so if I'm only concerned with answers, I'm going to look and say, great, these students both can add 2-digit numbers. We're going to move on to the next topic. But at Carroll, we're really focused on the process. And we understand that right answers are not all the same because student thinking can be so different and so varied, and can be evidence of such different levels of efficiency in their thinking and strategies. And so, if we really are trying to understand student thinking, we're not going to treat all 3 of these students exactly the same way. They each have different understandings. They each can approach this problem and solve it and get it correct, but they each have different understandings in terms of how they're using place value, how they're breaking numbers apart, how they're adding single-digit numbers that are going to require different needs and some different work. So again, all 3 students got the right answer. Their answers are not all the same. And I want to bring it back to a sec to our discussion about GPSing. So when we teach students how to get from point A to point B in that GPS manner, that is what's known as instrumental thinking, right? So we're teaching students a process and a procedure, and they can either perform that procedure or they can't. What we really here at Carroll try and have students do is use relational thinking. Okay, and again, relational thinking is knowing the landscape, being able to use numbers flexibly, so that when they run into challenges, they have other strategies for being able to solve problems. Our goal is to help students connect methods that are intuitive, concrete, and based a lot on visual models. And so we want procedural understanding that's increasingly more abstract and mathematically sophisticated. So again, building from concrete to abstract, building a connection between visual and abstract. And sometimes we think, oh, a student can multiply numbers and get a correct answer using maybe the multiplication algorithm. But does that student understand the relationship between the multiplication they've just done and, let's say, a problem that has to do with area? Would they be able to make that connection from the abstract math that they're doing to a more practical application? So again, that's instrumental versus relational understanding. Instrumental understanding is rules without reason, whereas relational understanding is making those connections, knowing not just what to do, but why and how and when to use certain procedures so that you're being efficient in your thinking and flexible in your thinking. So instrumental understanding is procedures without conceptual understanding. We want students to have a conceptual understanding of the procedures that we're teaching them. And that is what true fluency is. So fluency is not just being able to calculate and get a correct answer. To truly be fluent, students need to not only be able to be accurate, but also have knowledge of when and how to use certain procedures appropriately, and to have the skill in performing them flexibly, accurately, and efficiently. And so that might not always mean using the same procedure to solve every problem. And then finally, this comes from Common Core State Standards. And they talk about what it means for a student to be taught procedures without a real foundational understanding and what those procedures mean. And in the standards, it says students who lack understanding of a topic may rely on procedures too heavily. Without a flexible base from which to work, they may be less likely to consider analogous problems, represent problems coherently, justify conclusions, apply the mathematics to practical situations, step back for an overview, or deviate from a known procedure to find a shortcut. In short, a lack of understanding effectively prevents a student from engaging in the mathematical practices. So when students are learning procedures without understanding, they're really not able to engage in mathematical problem solving in a deep and meaningful way. So I'm going to hand it off to Jen, and she is going to take us home here.
And to continue with that theme, so I teach an Algebra 1 class in 8th grade, and I could simply ask my students a very straightforward question, a procedure that we've taught. And so we've gone through systems of equations and finding how to find how many solutions there are. There's a process in which we do follow to teach them. But the goal, again, is for kids to be flexible with that procedure, flexible with their approach, and to truly understand what they're doing and why it works. So a kid who is really reliant on a procedure might approach this problem and multiply the whole thing by 2. So Peter, if you click on it, and they might see that the top equation is equivalent to the bottom equation. And they'll say, okay, great, infinite solutions. But does that really truly show me that they understand what they're doing here? Or are they just blindly following a procedure that I've taught them? And so a problem that we might pose, and I'm going to give you it on the next page, and there's a video to go along with this, is a deeper level question.
Let's see. Let's make it easy, and let's have this be 1/2. So if so to get to here, we'd have to times everything by 2 to get rid of the 1/2. So you'd get 1x plus So what we actually have to do, because we can't use any numbers twice, we got to make this not 1/2, but equivalent to 1/2. So it's going to be 2, 4, and then you time. Oh, but I can't write times it by 2. So what I got to do is I got to erase this, and I actually got to make it 4, 8, and then you times this all by 2, and you'd get down here, if you move it over, because you add it to both sides, because it's a negative, so you do add whatever this is, x, you'd eventually end up with 1x plus 2y equals, let's just say 3, but since it's times 2, it's going to become 6. Yeah.
And so what you see here is the student was tasked with a very open-ended question. Fill in the boxes using the digits 1 through 9 at most one time each, so they can only use the digit once. Once you use it, it's gone, so that the first equation is the same as or infinite solutions as the next one. And so this could either be done to say how many solutions are there, or can you rearrange from standard form to slope-intercept form or vice versa? And what this really gets at is to show not only can you just compute, but are you truly understanding what you're doing when there's more restraint or problem solving on the task given to you. This is something that I would give to my students, both individually as an extra credit, or to really show that they know what they're doing before we move on. And something that I would give to our students in group work. Something that I really want to touch on is that group work is very valuable for all of our students. We want to hear multiple perspectives and multiple approaches, because kids learn from each other and they need to listen to each other's approaches and see why one procedure works versus theirs. And from those discussions come those great discoveries of, oh, wait, I like what you did there. That seems to be a little bit more efficient than what I did. And so a lot of these tasks that we're talking about, these are in isolation, but we do them in huge groups as well. Well, huge groups, not in group work as well. And so what we're really getting at here, and this is where we're kind of wrapping up, we want to move ourselves from the performance culture that we talked about before, where most students are thinking that their role is just to get that correct answer, get that check mark on the test, get that 100, to more of a learning-based culture. And this is where students think that they're in class to learn, to explore the ideas freely, understand more at the higher levels. So really get at that problem solving and applying what they know across broader topics. So not just the 70 questions in a row, can you graph the slope-intercept form problem, but how can you apply that in different and various contexts? So we want to take this mindset shift of the all too common approach in math, which is centered on memorization strategies for skills and procedures. And we want to move that to the big idea centered and problem solving while we're building those strategies to learn the skills and procedures and truly understand what you're doing. We want to go from deficit-based, so not just focusing on what you can't do, but the abundance-based approach to use your strengths and build on those strengths to build and fill in those holes as we move along. We also want to move from math learning is just linear to more landscape-based. Linear meaning, in order to move on to this, you got to master this. There's ways that we can incorporate and move between topics. So multiplication isn't gone once you've done it in the elementary grades. We're consistently going back to it, even through multiplying binomials and algebra and connecting those ideas. So to kind of wrap it up, what I want to pull together is we're going back to Patricia Heaton, poor Patricia Heaton, and thinking about how our approach can maybe help her. So let's see if there's a resolve here.
You don't lose till you say final answer if you have the wrong. Okay, here we go.
Wait, hold on. I'm so nervous.
Just say it. Say it right now.
I can't. I got to multiply it first in my head. So a euro's worth $1.50. So 5 euros. 5 times 5 is 25. Carry the 2. 5 times 5, 6, 7. That means 7.50. So not 50 dimes. It's not 90 pennies. I don't know.
Yeah, no, wait a minute. You know this. 50 dimes is how much?
50 cents. 50 dimes?
50 dimes.
It's $5.
There you go. 90 pennies. How many pennies make $1?
Okay, so 100.
All right. 70 nickels.
This is the worst question you could have asked me.
70 nickels. How many nickels in $1?
So 7 times 5, that's $3.50.
That leaves
Okay.
30 quarters. How many quarters in $1?
All right, I'll give you my answer. All right, my answer is a 30 quarter.
Final answer. Final answer. Yes.
And the message I want to leave with you there is many of our students think that when they can't immediately come up with an answer, that they can't approach the problem. The immediate recall, I don't know how to do this. But when you break it down and say, what does 50 dimes equal? And they say the answer, breaking the pieces into known parts and letting them know that it's a process. It's not just a jump to the answer and that you need to know it immediately, tends to unlock a lot for our children. And so the math is more of a, how do you get to that answer rather than just jumping straight to the answer. So we are wrapping up our presentation. I know a bunch of questions came in. I did want to just announce that there are 2 slides with resources that we will be sending out in the PDF of the slides. And if anything came up in the questions as well, we can add those in before they get sent out.
Thank you very much, Jen and Peter, for this incredibly rich presentation. I know all of us have really benefited from it, and thank you everybody who's joined us tonight and who's also sent in follow-up questions. We have some great questions. We will, as Jen mentioned, we will be following up after the presentation, and we can also include a link so that you can share this presentation with other members of your family or friends that were not able to be here tonight. And in addition, it will be on the website. So the first question that came in was regarding our curriculum. And the question was, do we use a specific curriculum here?
So I'll jump in with the middle school. The middle school bases its curriculum one off of the Common Core standards, but we use a curriculum called illustrative mathematics, but it is adapted to fit our students' needs so that there's information that's backfilled and then more space for the students as needed. So it's an open source curriculum that we're able to edit. So it's based off of that with our own additions.
And it's the same in the lower school. So our foundational curriculum is illustrative mathematics, but you will see a lot of teacher-produced and teacher-edited materials. There's really no kind of one-stop shop in terms of a one-size-fits-all curriculum for math for any students really, but particularly for students with language-based learning differences. And so while we use illustrative mathematics as a foundational text, teachers are really adept at Carroll at kind of making the curriculum accessible to our students and kind of rich and engaging for our students. So you'll see a lot of adapted materials.
And I would just add, especially in the middle school, we work closely with our speech and language pathologists to develop note resources that are our own for very broken down notes step by step in a way that kids who struggle with executive functioning can really remember the process that they're trying to do. And then the overview happens in the class. So that's part of our curriculum as well.
Thank you both. And that actually ties into another question that we got from someone tonight who is asking if you can please expand on how language, for example, having the children explain their work, is incorporated to generate math fluency among the students.
So I'll just piggyback on what I said. So a lot of what we do in class discussions is really breaking down step by step how a kid is approaching a problem. And so you'll hear a lot of teachers as they go along, what is your first move? What's your first step? Whereas some kids are already on step D or have done A through D in their head. What happens in there is there's a lot of area for kids to go awry, whether that's a fact fluency error that they're just not aware of, or they're doing something that's just a little off from the procedure than normal, but getting them to create that mantra inside their head. What's your first move? Okay, now what? Or even just simply, what information do you know? And what does that tell you? Because our kids do not intuitively break down problems to that degree consistently.
Thank you. And then another question that came in was, are there games or activities that I can do at home to support the strategies and skills and mathematical thinking that are all being taught at Carroll?
Yeah, I would say that the simplest kind of thing that you can do at home is just foster a thinking environment. And so oftentimes it can be daunting for a parent to, work on kind of, technical math problems or curriculum with their students. But just, for young students and older students, playing games with your kids where they need to use strategic thinking, right? So strategic thinking is such an important part of mathematical reasoning. Any sort of games or activities, blocks, Legos that deal with spatial reasoning, right? So such an important skill again with math when you think about geometry or just relational thinking and how parts relate to the whole. Getting kids using that engineering brain of theirs. So getting kids to be hands-on, to build, to work with materials with their hands, really helps them kind of, understand the world around them in a very visual and hands-on way. Cooking, think of all the just the practical everyday ways you use math, and incorporating that as much as you can into what you do with your kids. In a way that is, fun and engaging and not, a parent kind of telling me, we're going to, do our math facts now and do our flashcards.
Wonderful. And there was one more question that goes back to math anxiety that you all explained so clearly. What are some things that we do at Carroll to help reduce that math anxiety?
I'll start. I would say the first thing we do is getting to students to understand that whether or not they get the right or wrong answer is not the primary focus. And whether or not they work quickly is not the primary focus. So really emphasizing the fact that mathematicians and thinking mathematically means thinking deeply about problems, and that really the most important problems are not problems that we are able to solve quickly with one step. The most important thinking that goes on in math classroom and in mathematical thinking of your parents or the people in everyday life, and the mathematical thinking of mathematicians who do this as a profession. The focus is on deep understanding, deep thinking, taking your time, and not necessarily getting things done quickly. And also understanding that you're going to make mistakes and you learn more. So if you follow up with some of these resources about Jo Boaler, she talks about having a growth mindset and understanding that we learn more from making mistakes than we do from getting things right. I tell my students all the time, I could give you things that you'd be able to get right really easily, but your brain's not really working all that hard if I essentially give you problems that you already know the answer to. Your brain is working much harder when you have to actively engage in thinking about problems and solving problems. And it's okay to make mistakes. Mistakes are how we learn. So just fostering that growth mindset is a big part of reducing math anxiety.
Yep, and adding on to that, one thing that we do a lot is error analysis. And part of error analysis can be twofold. We usually start with fake student work, where the kids are going through and identifying where they can spot the error, which also builds mathematical proficiency because they have to follow the steps and make sure they're going the right way. However, one way we twist that is look at all the things that they did correct, and what type of error is this? Is this a fact fluency error? Is this a conceptual error? And in the grand scheme of things, if it's a fact fluency error, very small, and if we're aware of it, we can check for those errors as we go along. Conceptual, we might want to spend a little bit more time with. eventually leading to kids looking at their own work and identifying common errors, and being okay with those errors and knowing that they might happen, but hey, I'm going to check for it all the time. I also think our teachers are very open. I definitely am. I always reversed my numbers when I was in college. I would say, 616 instead of 661. And I knew that was an issue, so I always had to check for it. But being open and honest that adults make mistakes too as well, because kids look at a math teacher and they're like, they'll never make a math mistake. And that's just not the reality. So we're very open and honest about that.
Thank you. So we have gone through all of our questions. To all of the families who participated tonight, thank you for joining us. And especially a big thank you to Jen McAleer and Peter Morris for leading this incredibly detailed and thought-provoking and informative discussion on math. I hope we'll see you soon.